What was your worst day on the job? I'd been working at the office for 2 weeks, when my manager pulled me aside and said Patrick is coming by at 3 to drop off his laptop, so you need to leave. Before then, her hands were shaking, and when I asked who Patrick was, she whispered, the guy we fired from your position who said he'd kill his replacement. My stomach dropped as everything clicked, the scratch marks on my desk drawers, the dead flowers on my chair the first day, why people avoided eye contact when I worked in the break room. Naomi from accounting was throwing stuff in her bag. She said the day they fired Patrick, he'd grabbed the security guard's throat and said, whoever takes my job is dead. She showed me her car from last week with all 4 tires slashed and a note that said, for hiring my replacement. I wanted to throw up, realizing that was about me. She said security would be here, but then checked her phone and went white. The guard just called in sick. Same one who escorted Patrick out. It was noon, 3 hours until he arrived, and people were fleeing. Tom from it grabbed me, reeking of fear sweat, and said they'd found a document on Patrick's computer titled Replacement Research with everyone who'd applied for the job. My photo was circled with notes about my apartment building. They'd also found searches for acids that dissolve bodies and how to make deaths look accidental, and my legs were shaking so bad I had to sit. By 1, the office was emptying, and I was paralyzed by the thought he might be watching the parking lot. My manager came back crying, saying I shouldn't have hired you for his position, but corporate insisted. My car had been keyed last week with thief, and I realized he'd been watching me in the parking garage while I worked at his desk. 2 and only 8 people remained. Leo showed me Patrick's social media, my LinkedIn announcement about the new position with a knife stabbed through it, captioned, time to vacate. My position. I was shaking as I realized he'd been watching since before I started planning this every day I'd been here. My keycard was missing from my desk, and panic flooded through me. I was trapped. 2:30 and Leo screamed he just posted again. The photo showed our building's lobby from inside, taken 5 minutes ago, the security desk, abandoned. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. Everyone ran for the elevator, but it was jammed with something wedged in the doors. The stairs were no better. Keycard reader smashed to pieces. We were trapped on the 10th floor, and I could taste bile in my throat. 2:45, and my phone rang from an unknown number. My hand shook as I answered. Patrick's voice. You're sitting in my chair right now, aren't you? At my desk using my keyboard. I looked around wildly, feeling watched, violated, knowing dozens of hidden cameras could be anywhere. He continued. I worked that position 5 years, built those client relationships, and you've had it 2 weeks. Doesn't seem fair. The line went dead, and I was crying, terrified, wishing I'd never taken this job. 250. And we heard the freight elevator moving, the one nobody used. My whole body shook violently as Claire whispered that Patrick had worked maintenance before. Our department knew every way in and out, had copies of every key. People scattered to hide under desks and in supply closets, but I was frozen at his desk, my legs like concrete. Terror had locked every muscle. 2:55 and the lights went out with a loud pop. I bit my hand to keep from screaming as emergency lighting kicked in. 3 exactly. Footsteps came from the back hallway, slow and deliberate. My heart hammered so loud I was sure he could hear it from across the office. A voice called out, I'm here for my laptop and my job. Only one of those is leaving with me. I was sobbing silently, tears blurring my vision as the footsteps got closer. He said, I know you're at my desk. I can see the heat signature from the camera I installed months ago. Waved to me. The violation of being watched all this time made me want to vomit. I heard him breathing now, harsh and excited, just 1 row away. The security guard tried to stop me downstairs. He's not conscious anymore. Every instinct screamed run, but I was paralyzed with pure terror. Then he stepped around the corner, face twisted with rage, holding a crowbar with something dark and wet on it, my missing keycard in the other hand, and I knew I was going to die at this desk, his desk, and he smiled like he knew it too. Patrick took another step toward me and raised the crowbar high above his head. My body finally broke through the paralysis, and I dropped hard to the floor, my knees hitting the carpet with a painful thud. I rolled sideways under the desk just as the crowbar came down and smashed into the computer monitor where my head had been a second ago. The screen exploded in a shower of glass and sparks that rained down on the floor beside me. My Phone was still clutched in my sweaty hand, and I fumbled to unlock it while wedged under the desk, my fingers shaking so bad I could barely type. I managed to open the text to 911 and typed, "Help, office attack." Before Patrick's feet appeared on the other side of the desk, he was circling around, trying to find an angle to reach me with the crowbar, and I could hear him breathing hard with excitement as he dropped to one knee to look under. I pulled my legs up tight against my chest and scooted further back into the corner, where the desk met the wall. His face appeared upside down, eyes wild and unfocused, and he swung the crowbar under the desk but couldn't quite reach me in the corner. Leo suddenly shouted from across the office, something about calling the cops, and Patrick's head snapped toward the noise. I used those precious seconds to slide out the other side of the desk on my stomach and started crawling on hands and knees between the cubicle panels. The rough carpet burned my palms as I moved fast, staying low, hearing Patrick's heavy footsteps heading toward where Leo had yelled from. My phone vibrated with a text from 911 asking for our exact location and how many people needed help. I pressed myself against a cubicle wall and quickly typed back the building address, 10th floor, 8 people trapped with an armed attacker who already hurt the security guard downstairs. Patrick's voice boomed across the office saying something about this being his workspace, his life, and then I heard a massive crash as he started smashing cubicle walls with the crowbar. The thin panels cracked and splintered under the metal bar as he worked his way systematically through the office, checking each workstation for hiding people. I kept moving in a crouch, using the maze of cubicles to stay ahead of him, pausing only to text updates to the dispatcher about his location in the office. The dispatcher texted back telling me to silence my phone completely and asked what weapon Patrick had and if anyone was hurt. I switched my phone to silent and confirmed he had a crowbar and mentioned the unconscious guard downstairs, my hands still shaking as I typed each word carefully. Another cubicle wall crashed down somewhere behind me and I could hear Patrick getting closer, his breathing loud and ragged in the quiet office. Claire suddenly whispered my name from behind a big filing cabinet near the copy room. We made eye contact and she pointed toward the break room, mouthing something about the fire alarm. Patrick was between us and the alarm, still smashing his way through workstations, and we both knew someone would have to distract him. I looked at the distance to the break room, then at Claire crouched behind the cabinet, and made a decision that went against every instinct in my body. I stood up suddenly, in the middle of the office, fully visible, and Patrick's head whipped toward me instantly. He started moving in my direction with the crowbar raised, and I backed away slowly, keeping his attention on me while Claire sprinted behind him toward the break room. My legs felt like jelly as I moved backward between desks, watching him advance with that crowbar, leaving dents in everything he passed. Patrick was completely focused on me, ranting about 5 years of work stolen and didn't notice Claire reaching the break room door. She yanked the fire alarm and suddenly the office exploded with deafening sirens and strobing white lights that lit up everything in harsh flashes. Patrick stopped mid-step, his face contorting in confusion at the sudden sensory overload, and he spun around trying to figure out what was happening. The sirens were so loud I couldn't hear anything else, just this piercing wail that seemed to drill into my skull. Several of us used the chaos to move toward the conference room at the far end of the office, staying low and using the strobing lights as cover. Patrick was turning in circles, disoriented by the noise and light, swinging the crowbar at nothing. My phone vibrated with another text from the dispatcher saying the fire alarm had notified emergency services and they were on the way up. The building's magnetic locks should release on the stairwells, but when 2 CO workers tried the door, it only opened partway before catching on. Something. Patrick had jammed something in the mechanism that kept it from opening fully, and people could only squeeze through one at a time if they turned sideways. The sirens kept blaring and the lights kept flashing A's. We tried to figure out our next move, knowing help was coming but not knowing how long it would take them to reach us. On the 10th floor, my manager suddenly grabbed my arm from behind a desk and pulled me down next to her, her face wet with tears and makeup running everywhere. She held up her phone, showing a group text she'd started with everyone still in the office, typing that we needed to move to the archive room. The archive room had a heavy door with an old deadbolt lock that might actually hold against the crowbar better than these thin office doors would. She typed quickly while the sirens kept screaming and told everyone to use the noise as cover to move without Patrick hearing us. I watched Patrick through a gap between cubicles as he shook his head hard, trying to clear the ringing from his ears after the alarm shock. He was turning in circles with the crowbar raised, looking confused and angry as the strobing lights made everything look like stop-motion animation. My manager squeezed my hand and pointed toward the hallway leading to the archive room, then started crawling that direction on her hands and knees. Patrick suddenly stopped spinning and started moving, again more focused now but clearly having trouble tracking sounds over the deafening alarm noise. He swung the crowbar at a desk, sending papers flying everywhere, then stopped to listen for any reaction from us hiding nearby. I realized the sirens were actually helping us because he couldn't hear our movements or whispers over the constant wailing sound filling the office. My phone buzzed with texts from others saying they were using the alarm noise to move toward the archive room one by one. I needed to keep Patrick's attention away from that hallway, so I stood up near the reception desk and knocked over a big potted plant. The crash was barely audible over the sirens, but Patrick's head snapped toward me and he started moving in my direction fast. He was shouting something, but I couldn't hear the words over the alarm, just saw his mouth moving and face getting redder with rage. I backed away slowly, keeping furniture between us while he followed me away from where the others were, escaping to safety. His voice finally broke through the noise, screaming about 5 years of building client relationships that I'd stolen in just 2 weeks. The pain in his voice was real, even through the rage, years of work and identity, wrapped up in a job that wasn't his anymore. My phone vibrated and I glanced down to see the dispatcher had sent a message saying they'd connected with our building engineer. The engineer was texting instructions about emergency exits on our floor that Patrick might not know about from his maintenance days. There was an old fire escape on the north side that could be accessed through a window if we could get to it safely. 2 CO workers were working on the stairwell door using a letter opener and scissors to try clearing whatever Patrick had jammed in there. I kept moving backward from Patrick, then suddenly yelled that I understood he was angry about losing his job even though he couldn't hear me well. Patrick stopped and tilted his head, trying to make out my words over the sirens, giving the others more time to work on escape routes. He started ranting back about being moved to maintenance after some complaints, treated like he was worthless after 5 years of good work. His voice cracked when he said nobody even looked at him anymore, just walked past like he was invisible or furniture. The hurt underneath his anger felt real, but it didn't make what he was doing okay. And I told him that while staying behind desks. He swung the crowbar into a computer monitor, sending glass and plastic everywhere, then kept moving toward me with that wet crowbar raised. Leo suddenly texted everyone that he'd found a computer still logged in near the break room and could make noise remotely. Within seconds, keyboards started clicking and typing sounds came from empty cubicles all around the office in random patterns. Patrick spun around confused, checking cubicles that were making typing noises, but finding nobody there, getting more frustrated. With each empty desk, the phantom keyboard sounds kept going off in different areas, making him run back and forth, checking workstations while we gained time. Claire texted that she and another CO worker had gotten the stairwell door partially open, enough to squeeze through sideways, one person at a time. The process was slow because of how narrow the opening was, but at least people could start escaping down the stairs now. I remembered what Patrick said about heat signature cameras and grabbed a jacket from someone's chair. Looking up at the ceiling corners, there was a tiny red light in the corner near his old desk that I hadn't noticed before. Definitely not standard office equipment. Requested reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I threw the jacket up and it caught on the camera mount, covering the lens and hopefully blocking whatever feed Patrick had been watching. More tiny red lights were visible now that I knew what to look for. At least 4 more cameras hidden around the office space. Each one I could cover meant less advantage for Patrick, though I had no idea how many he'd installed over the months. Patrick was getting more frustrated with the phantom typing and empty cubicles, his movements getting wilder and less controlled. With the crowbar, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a book of matches, lighting one and dropping it into a trash can full of paper. The papers caught immediately and smoke started rising as he moved to another trash can, lighting more fires as he went. Within seconds, the sprinkler system activated in that section, water spraying down and mixing with the smoke to create even more chaos. The water made the floor slippery, and Patrick almost fell, catching himself on a desk while still holding that crowbar in one hand. The combination of sirens, strobing lights, smoke and water spray turned the office into complete sensory overload that was hard to navigate. My clothes were getting soaked from the sprinklers as I kept moving, trying to stay ahead of Patrick while others escaped through the stairwell. The smoke was getting thicker, despite the water making it harder to breathe and see where Patrick was in the chaos. My phone buzzed with a text from the dispatcher and I saw the battery was down to 12%. The message said police were entering the building, but they had to clear each floor for safety, which would take time. Patrick suddenly appeared through the smoke near the supply closet where 2 CO workers were trying to hide behind a filing cabinet. I grabbed the nearest fire extinguisher and ran toward them, pulling the pin and spraying white foam directly at Patrick's face from behind. The chemical cloud hit him hard and he stumbled backward, swinging the crowbar blindly, while coughing and trying to wipe his eyes. One of the CO workers tried to run past him, but the crowbar caught their arm and tore through their shirt, blood immediately soaking the fabric. We dragged them away from Patrick, who was still rubbing his eyes and cursing, pulling them into the conference room, where someone ripped off their shirt to press against the wound. I typed a quick text to the dispatcher about the injury, while others helped apply pressure to stop the bleeding. The dispatcher texted back immediately with instructions to barricade the door with everything we could move. We started stacking tables and chairs against the door while Patrick's footsteps got closer. Then his crowbar slammed into the door, making everyone jump back. The deadbolt was holding, but I could see the door frame starting to crack with each hit. My manager was in the corner having a complete breakdown, sobbing about how she should have seen the warning signs and never hired me for the position. I grabbed her shoulders and told her we needed her help tying door handles together with computer cords to make them harder to open. She nodded and started gathering cords from nearby desks, her hands shaking, but at least she had something to focus on now. Patrick changed tactics and started working on the door hinges with his crowbar, metal scraping against metal as he pried at the pins. We realized we didn't have much time and started wedging more furniture against the door, using our belts to tie the handles together while the frame kept cracking. My phone buzzed with a text from the building engineer who said there was a service shaft behind a panel in the conference room that connected to a mechanical room below. We started looking frantically along the walls, while Patrick kept attacking the door, finally finding a panel near the corner that looked different from the others. Half the group wanted everyone to try the shaft, but I said we should split up, because someone needed to keep Patrick focused here while others escaped. After a quick argument we agreed, even though splitting up felt dangerous, but staying together wasn't working either. I told them I'd stay and keep Patrick talking through the door while putting my phone on speaker so the dispatcher could hear everything. 2 CO workers started quietly removing the panel screws while I moved closer to the door and said his name to get his attention. Patrick stopped hitting the door and demanded to know why I took his job, his voice full of rage, but something else too. I told him honestly that I just needed work to pay my rent and didn't know anything about him when I applied. He screamed that I'd stolen 5 years of his life, 5 years of building client relationships and proving himself, and now I had it, after 2 weeks. The pain in his voice was real, even mixed with the anger, and I could hear him breathing hard on the other side of the door. Behind me, the panel came loose and the first coworker started climbing into the narrow shaft, having to squeeze through sideways. Patrick started hitting the door again, and I kept talking, telling him I understood he was hurt, but this wasn't going to fix anything. He laughed bitterly and said, I didn't understand anything about losing everything you worked for to someone who didn't even know your name. The second coworker disappeared into the shaft while Patrick ranted about being invisible, being treated like he didn't exist after giving everything to this company. More people were getting ready to climb through, but we needed to keep Patrick focused on this room and not searching for other ways in. I asked him about the cameras he'd installed and he actually sounded proud, saying he'd been watching for months, learning our schedules and habits. The violation of it made my skin crawl, but I kept him talking while others escaped, asking how long he'd been planning this. He said from the day they moved him to maintenance, the day they decided he wasn't good enough anymore despite perfect reviews for years. Another coworker squeezed into the shaft, and I heard Patrick testing the door again, checking how much the frame had weakened. My phone showed 8% battery and I worried about losing contact with the dispatcher who was recording everything for evidence. Patrick went quiet for a moment then, said he knew people were escaping, because he could hear movement in the walls from his maintenance knowledge. I told him most of us were still here, which was partly true, trying to buy more time for the others to get through the shaft. He started attacking the door, harder and faster, the frame splintering, more with each hit as the last two CO workers climbed into the shaft. Only my manager and I were left with the injured coworker who couldn't move easily with their arm wound still, bleeding through the makeshift bandage. Patrick got one hinge loose and the door shifted, hanging at an angle that created a gap he could almost reach through. We pushed more furniture but knew it wouldn't hold much longer as he worked on the second hinge with determination. The dispatcher texted that police were on the 8th floor, just 2 floors below us, but Patrick was going to get through before they arrived. I moved closer to the door and said loud enough for him to hear that I knew about the keyed car and the dead flowers he left on my chair. Patrick stopped hitting the door for a second and screamed that we were all thieves who took what he built. His voice cracked and went higher then lower, like something was breaking inside him. My phone buzzed with a text from the 2 CO workers who'd gone through the shaft, saying they made it to the mechanical room. They were looking for another way out, but we had to keep pretending everyone was still trapped here with us. I texted back quickly while Patrick ranted about 5 years of work stolen by people who didn't care about him. My manager was shaking next to me, and the injured co-worker was getting paler from blood loss. Patrick's voice got louder and more broken as he talked about building every client relationship from nothing. Then he went completely quiet, and we heard his footsteps moving away from the door. The sudden silence made my skin crawl worse than his yelling had. Nobody moved or even breathed loud as we listened to figure out where he went. The emergency lights kept flickering and making shadows jump on the walls. My phone showed 6% battery, and I turned the brightness all the way down to save power. Minutes passed with no sound from Patrick, and the waiting was making everyone more scared. The injured co-worker started moaning softly, and my manager pressed her hand over his mouth to keep him quiet. Then we smelled smoke and saw it starting to creep under the door in thin gray wisps. Patrick had set something on fire in the hallway, and the smoke was getting thicker fast. The sprinklers turned on outside with a loud, hissing sound, but smoke kept coming in. The dispatcher texted to stay low and use wet clothing to block the gap under the door. We grabbed jackets and shirts, ran them under the water cooler, and stuffed them against the door bottom. The smoke was already making my eyes burn and throat feel raw. Outside we heard sirens getting louder, and my phone buzzed with the dispatcher confirming fire trucks were arriving. Police units were also coming, but she warned it would take several minutes for them to reach our floor safely. The smoke was building up near the ceiling, and we all got down on our hands and knees where the air was clearer. My manager was crying and holding the injured CO worker's hand while trying to keep pressure on his wound. The wet clothes helped, but smoke still leaked through and made breathing harder. Then we heard footsteps coming back and the sound of metal on metal. Patrick had found bolt cutters somewhere and was cutting through the chains we'd wrapped around the door handles. The snapping sounds as each link broke made my stomach twist. I texted the dispatcher what was happening while trying not to cough from the smoke. Patrick was working fast, and we could see the chains getting looser through the door gap. We pushed more furniture but knew it wouldn't matter once he got the chains off. My hands were shaking as I held my phone up and started recording video. If something bad happened to us, there needed to be proof of what Patrick did. The phone picked up his heavy breathing and the sound of chains falling to the floor. He started using the crowbar on the door again and yelled that he was taking back what was his. I made sure the recording caught every word while tears ran down my face from the smoke. My phone buzzed with a text from the CO workers who'd escaped through the shaft. They found another stairwell and were heading down to meet the emergency responders. They promised to tell them exactly where we were trapped. Patrick got the chains completely off and started prying at the door with the crowbar. The frame was so damaged that it started bending inward with each pull. We pressed ourselves against the back wall as far from the door as we could get. Some people were crying and others just stared at the widening gap where Patrick would come through. The smoke was getting thicker and making it hard to see across the room. My manager was whispering prayers while holding the injured co-worker who'd gone unconscious. Patrick got one side of the door open, about 6 in, and we could see his face through the gap. His eyes were wild and unfocused, like he wasn't really seeing. us anymore. He pulled harder on the crowbar and the gap got wider with wood, splintering and cracking. My phone buzzed and the dispatcher's text said, "Police were on our floor and moving toward us." She told us to stay quiet and not make sudden moves when they arrived. Patrick was pulling so hard on the door that his face was red and veins stood out on his neck. The gap was almost wide, enough for him to squeeze through, and we had nowhere left to run. I kept recording everything while trying not to shake the phone too much. The smoke was making everyone cough and our eyes were streaming tears. Patrick got the door open enough to push his shoulder through and started forcing his way in. That's when we heard shouting from down the hallway and boots running on the floor. My manager was shaking bad next to me, and her eyes looked empty, like she wasn't really there anymore. I grabbed her hand and squeezed it while telling her to count her breaths with me. 1 in, 2 out, trying to keep us both from losing it completely. The police were getting closer, and we could hear them yelling commands, but Patrick wasn't backing down from our door. He shoved his whole arm through the gap he'd made, swinging the crowbar wild, trying to hit anyone close enough. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and brought it down hard on his arm where it came through. He screamed and yanked his arm back so fast the crowbar dropped on our side of the door. Someone shouted, "Police!" right outside, and Patrick spun away from us. There was running and more shouting, and then that electric crackling sound a taser makes. Patrick hit the floor hard and we could hear it through the wall. The police were all over him in seconds, one officer on each arm while another secured the crowbar. They had him in cuffs fast while he was still twitching from the taser. We stayed frozen against the back wall until an officer pulled our barricade away and opened what was left of our door. He said we were safe now, but nobody moved for a few seconds, like we couldn't believe it was real. The paramedics came in right after and went straight to the coworker who'd been hit earlier. His arm was still bleeding through the shirt we'd wrapped around it, and they started working on him while checking the rest of us. One paramedic told us the security guard downstairs was awake but had a bad concussion, and they were taking him to the hospital first. They loaded him on a stretcher while another paramedic checked my throat for smoke damage. A detective showed up while I was still shaking from everything and started asking questions about what happened. I handed him my phone with all the recordings and texts from the whole thing, explaining how it started at noon. When my manager warned me about Patrick coming at 3, he scrolled through everything while taking notes and asking me to clarify times and details. My manager kept apologizing over and over, saying she should have done more, should have shut the office down when she found out Patrick was coming. The HR people showed up with their tablets and papers, talking about counseling services and paid leave, while also asking lots of questions about who knew what and when. You could tell they were worried about getting sued because they kept asking about documentation and whether proper procedures were followed. That night, I couldn't sleep at all, just kept seeing Patrick's face through that door gap. The next morning, a victim advocate called and asked to meet with me at the courthouse. She explained that Patrick was charged with attempted murder, plus a bunch of other stuff like assault, making threats, and false imprisonment. She said I'd have to testify at the trial and walked me through what that would mean, how long it might take, what questions they'd ask. She gave me a folder full of papers about victim rights and support services. I started therapy that same week because the panic attacks were hitting me randomly, like in the grocery store or just sitting at home. The therapist taught me this thing, where you name 5 things you can see, 4 you can hear, 3 you can touch, 2 you can smell, and 1 you can taste, to ground yourself when the panic starts. She said my reactions were totally normal for what happened and gave me exercises to do when I felt triggered. We worked on breathing techniques and she explained how trauma affects your brain and body. The company went crazy with security changes after that. Within 2 weeks they had new cameras everywhere, not the hidden ones, like Patrick's, but real security cameras with signs posted. They hired 3 full-time guards instead of just 1 and put in panic buttons at every desk. The stairwell doors got new locks that couldn't be jammed, and they installed a whole new alarm system. They brought in some expert to do a threat assessment and started making everyone take training on recognizing warning signs. The expert said there had been red flags with Patrick for months that nobody reported properly. They changed the rules so that fired employees had to turn in all their stuff immediately and couldn't come back to the building for any reason. Building access got stricter too, with everyone having to badge in and out and visitors needing approval in advance. The new security guards actually walked the floors instead of just sitting at the desk Downstairs, they also started doing background checks on everyone, even current employees, which made some people mad, but I was glad for it. My sleep was still messed up weeks later, and I'd wake up thinking I heard footsteps or Patrick's voice. 2 weeks after everything happened, the company offered me a transfer to their office across town, and I took it without thinking twice. The commute went from 15 minutes to an hour each way, but I'd rather sit in traffic than walk past that desk every day. Leo and Claire took transfers too, while Tom decided to stay, said the new security made him feel safe enough. My new desk was on the 3rd floor of a building, with actual security guards who checked badges and walked the floors, not just one guy who could be scared into calling in sick. The prosecutor's office kept calling with updates, and one morning, Patrick's lawyer left a voicemail asking if we could discuss a plea deal. My hand shook, deleting it, but the victim advocate called right after and explained Patrick was getting evaluated by psychiatrists while his lawyer tried to avoid trial. She forwarded me parts of the evaluation that talked about Patrick losing his dad right before the demotion to maintenance, how he'd stopped taking his medication for bipolar disorder, how the job had been the only stable thing in his life for 5 years. None of it excused what he did, but it helped me understand how someone goes from employee of the month to hiding cameras in the office ceiling. 3 months crawled by with depositions and meetings until the prosecutor called to say Patrick agreed to plead guilty to everything. 8 years in prison with mandatory mental health treatment and a permanent restraining order that meant he could never contact any of us again. I actually slept through the night for the first time after hearing that. No more waking up at 3 in the morning, thinking I heard footsteps. My old manager started sending me emails about all the changes she was making, new background check requirements and threat assessment protocols, and actually following through on the security promises. This time she'd attached photos of the new panic buttons and emergency procedures posted everywhere, trying to show she learned from what happened. I signed up for self-defense classes at the gym near my new office, and spent Tuesday and Thursday evenings learning how to break holds and create distance. The instructor was this older woman who'd been attacked years ago, and she taught us to be aware without being scared of everything, how to trust our instincts without letting fear control our lives. Learning to throw a proper punch and break someone's grip on my wrist made me feel less helpless, like I had some control back. 6 months passed, and I was actually enjoying work again. At the new location, the panic attacks that used to hit me in elevators or when someone walked up behind my desk had gotten down to maybe once a week.